Hello, this is Lyudmila Nemyria, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev. And we are very happy that our guest today is Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman. He is Emeritus Professor of War Studies in King's College in London. Professor, hello, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Pleasure.
Professor, a couple of days ago, you wrote a remarkable article. How can Ukraine's security be guaranteed? Is there a role for a European multinational force? And at the very beginning of your article, you put a crucial question about security guarantees in principle. And you take two very interesting examples from modern history. One of them is NATO Article 5, and you even call it the gold standard. But at the same time, you talk about some of its vulnerabilities. And the second example is just the Budapest Memorandum, which didn't work at all.
No.
And in that case, let me address your question for you from your article. Can security really be guaranteed?
I think the difficulty is, in absolute terms, the answer has to be no, because with any guarantee, as we know in everyday life, there's always small print, there's always a get-out clause, and most of the time guarantees are honoured, but you can't be sure of it in all circumstances, and in some cases it's unwise to rely on it in all circumstances. So the problem, one problem with security guarantees is that those being guaranteed are bound to have some doubts about how well this will work. I mean, I think the Budapest Memorandum is a good example, and part of the problem there was that it wasn't just that people were guaranteeing to come to Ukraine's aid if it was attacked, they were promising not to attack, and one of those making the promise was Russia, which obviously didn't honour it. So most security guarantees of the sort that are being discussed now for Ukraine aren't particularly about people promising not to attack Ukraine. They're about whether or not people will come to Ukraine's aid. And I think in that case, it depends to some extent on what they can do about it if there is a further crisis, but also the circumstances. One of the reasons why it's hard to get Ukraine into NATO now is because Ukraine is in the middle of a war. That, in a way, means as soon as you brought Ukraine into the alliance, NATO would be at war. And that's something NATO countries are reluctant to commit to. That's why it's easier to agree this after a ceasefire or peace treaty or something like that. So I think you just have to accept that there are doubts. Just the final point, just to counter that, there are doubts in both directions. So the Russians may know full well that Ukraine can't wholly rely on guarantees given by its supporters, but there's a doubt in their minds too, as to, well, maybe they might, maybe they would do what they should do if there's further aggression. So we're talking about risks here, but we're not talking about certainties.
Professor, let's discuss two scenarios for Ukraine. First, if a deal and the end of the war is possible.
Yeah.
And second one, if no deal, no end of the war. And let's start from the deal and possible end of the war. And in that case, let me quote you part of your article, because it was just brilliant. How Ukraine's future security will be supported as part of any deal. In recent months, we have been hearing a lot about a possible peacekeeping contingent, peacekeeping forces, including Keir Starmer when speaking about a possible UK contribution. But elsewhere, it has been described as a deterrent or tripwire. So there are very different concepts. And you suggested to unpack this concept and related them to the current situation in Ukraine. Professor, please do it. Just please unpack these concepts for us.
Okay. I mean, language is used very loosely in this area, and people like me who've been working in the field for a very long time may have very precise ideas about what the language means, but when they get used in a loose way, then they can start to mean different things. So one has to be careful in that sense. But if you're trying to use these concepts carefully, I think you'd say a peacekeeping force traditionally has been lightly armed, armed largely for self-defense, deployed along a ceasefire line, which of course in Ukraine's case would be very long, and with the objective of reporting, if you like, on breaches of the ceasefire. Now, you had something like this with the Minsk agreement, with the role played by the OSCE, which did report on what was going on, couldn't do much about it. You have something like the UNIFIL in Lebanon, which again could see what was going on, but couldn't do very much about it. So I don't think the peacekeeping model is particularly helpful. What we don't have actually any difficulty in knowing if the Russians are moving forces en masse. I mean, they're being watched quite carefully, so that's not the issue. We knew what they were in a position to do in February 22. Then you get deployment of actual serious forces, not sort of spread thinly, but possibly based behind a Ukrainian frontline force. And the aim here is to deter. And the best deterrent is a force substantial enough to make it hard for the Russians to progress. And for that, you'd probably need air power of some sort, Western air power committed. And ideally, you'd want the Americans as well, although President Trump doesn't seem too keen on that.
We need a big contingent for in that case.
I think if you want a proper deterrent force, you need quite big.
Yeah.
However, there's another concept, which is the tripwire. And the idea of the tripwire, which you can imagine from old cartoons and movies, is something that catches somebody when they're coming through and doesn't stop them, but as they trip, they bring a whole lot of trouble onto themselves. And the idea of a tripwire is as soon as NATO forces were engaged, as Western countries were engaged, even with quite a small force, that would oblige them to, in a sense, go to war with Russia. And all of a sudden it become a much bigger conflict, and Russia would know that. So that would have a sort of deterrent effect. So that's essentially the idea of a tripwire. The difficulty with a tripwire is you can't be sure what's going to happen if it is tripped. So the ideal is maybe something in between, but the ideal is as big a force as you can manage. The difficulty there, as Ukraine well knows, is to keep forces at the front. You actually need a much larger force behind it. You need forces to be training, you need forces a chance to recover when they've been in the field and so on. So you're talking about large numbers, and it's not that Europe is incapable of generating these numbers. It could do, but they're substantial. And whether public opinion has been prepared for it is again another question. And I mean, just to round this off, it's one thing to do this if there's been a ceasefire of some sort or a wider peace treaty agreed. If that isn't agreed, then you're just joining the war. And again, some of us have fewer problems with that than others, but excuse me, it would be a big step for governments to take. So then I think you're looking at other things that the West can do to keep supporting Ukraine, which don't involve contributions of their own forces. So these are the sort of range of debates going on at the moment.
It is very interesting, these two concepts, deterrent and tripwire. And even when I try to prepare for our interview, I try to find in what country, what model was used. And wonderful that in South Korea, for example, it means that in South Korea, you have the same model, deterrence and tripwire. How it is possible? Is it really true?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, a lot of these ideas came out during the 1950s. They're Cold War concepts. So they reflect situations as you had in South Korea after the Korean War, with the demilitarized zone, where you have a sharp separation of forces, but still pretty highly armed. And South Korea is dependent upon its allies, particularly on the United States. In NATO during the Cold War, you have the Iron Curtain, Warsaw Pact countries on one side, NATO countries on the other. There was a very clear line. And those days, there was concern that an overwhelming force could make life very difficult for the NATO defenders, but there would be a tripwire. It would lead to a much bigger war. And that's what the Russians or the Soviets would have to take into account. So these are Cold War concepts. That's where they come from. And with all Cold War concepts, you have to be a little careful about how you apply them in much different settings.
Let's pay some attention for second scenario. For example, if no deal, no end of the war. Does it mean that no deal, no security guarantees?
Well, I mean, a lot of countries, including the UK, have signed treaties, defence agreements, they've made promises. And to the extent that, in the end, the best security guarantee Ukraine has is the quality of its own forces and the strength of its economy and all these things, that everything that we can do at the moment to reinforce Ukraine is reinforcing its security. So it tends, I mean, people think of security guarantees as something that is given as an ally, but you can improve the security of a country, as I hope we're trying to improve the security of Ukraine, by allowing them to buy more weapons, to donate weapons, to donate training capabilities. And there are some areas, say in air defense, patrolling the Black Sea, providing intelligence, a number of things that can be done, which will become increasingly relevant, I think, if the war does carry on, which is as likely as any agreement, that can be supporting Ukraine. And I'm not sure security guarantee is the best way to talk about those things, but they should, it's things to improve, excuse me, it's things to improve Ukraine's security, which is what we're basically talking about, to give Ukraine more confidence about the future. And I think, quite importantly, to give investors in Ukraine confidence that it's going to be a safe environment, that it'll still be here in 10, 20, 30 years' time. And it's a country to bet on. I mean, that's what you're also trying to do with this.
Professor, do you think that deal and the end or the stop of the war is possible?
It's very difficult to know at the moment. If you look at what the Russians say, I don't think there's a basis for a deal on Russian terms. I'm sure it's not one that Ukrainians would accept. And obviously there's worry that Trump might sort of strong arm the Ukrainians into accepting a deal that undermines the Ukrainian sovereignty and integrity and so on. But I think if you look at what officials have said in the administration, that's not what they want. And the basic problem, as I see it, for Putin, is although he's laid claim to the territory, indeed more than the territory the Russian forces currently occupy, that by itself is not good enough, because which would, he could get possibly through a ceasefire. I mean, Ukraine wouldn't acknowledge Russian ownership, but in practice, Russia might be running those territories. But it's not a great prize for Russia at the moment. It requires an awful lot of money, as we all know, to deal with unexploded ordnance, to rebuild, to repopulate. It's a big task. I just don't think Russia has got the resources. If it also has to be defended, if Russia has to keep permanent garrisons there, because Ukraine is they've been able to build up its own armaments and strengthen its own position, perhaps with or without security guarantees. It doesn't work for Russia. I just don't see how that works. I think the big issue in any talks is neutrality, which is why Putin has not been particularly keen on a ceasefire without a peace agreement. Personally, I don't think it works for him. Now, there are problems in the Russian economy. There are problems. The Russian forces have made progress, but at an extraordinary cost. It's not a very impressive performance, as Trump has kept on reminding Putin. So it may be that they're prepared to cut a deal, which I think would be, quite popular back in Russia, because I think people there are fed up with the war, as undoubtedly they are in Ukraine as well. But ceasefire deals are agreed with a view to what happens if the ceasefire is broken. And I think this is Putin's chance. I think basically, if he doesn't get what he wants after all this effort, then it will be seen as a failure on his part, even if there's some territory moves from Ukraine to Russia. So I think that's why I've been skeptical. I think the Russians recently have been trying to sound a bit more positive. I think Zelensky, played quite a clever game in getting close to Trump quite early on, sounding positive, talking as if the Ukraine would I'm sure Ukraine would welcome the relief from some sort of ceasefire. I think the Russians realize they need to catch up on this, but they've still got a basic problem: is that the formal position they set out, basically last June, is not one that Ukraine, or I think the US, the rest of the West, could accept. So I think we'll see. There was a story which appeared, I think, in Newsweek, which is supposedly a leak of an American plan, but it's almost certainly a Russian plant. And if it was, it's only interesting as indicating some areas where they might make concession. And the basic concession, if my supposition is right, no idea if it is that maybe they would agree to a ceasefire first if there was a clear timetable towards a peace deal with it, and if there was a clear commitment by Ukraine and the West to the neutralization and disarmament of Ukraine. And just final point, the Russians are also after sort of this wider European security order, the sort of stuff they were talking about in December 21, which again, I don't think anybody from the West is up for agreeing to. It's not clear actually what it would look like in practice. So I'm pretty skeptical at the moment. But once these things are set in motion, you can never be sure. The Russians will have to respond to some American proposals. Maybe General Kellogg is going to put them down at the Munich Security Conference next week. And if that's the case, then they'll have to see if they've got some concessions to make, because if they don't, it's a dead end.
By the way, if we speak about the security guarantees, Russia constantly say that they need security guarantees. As nuclear power, as big country, they need a security guarantees. What does it mean?
Well, I think you have to look back at the Russian propaganda. I mean, it's always difficult when you look at this to work out, is this just contrived, just a pretext, made up story to justify aggressive action, or whether deep in their minds somehow they fear Ukraine. I mean, if that is the problem, it's not hard to say, well, actually, Ukraine doesn't have as no objective of occupying all of Russia. I think the main sort of guarantees they'd be after would be, and again, there was something in that story I mentioned, that Ukraine would promise not to try to retake by force, particularly Ukraine, but possibly the other oblasts as well. I think that's what they would be asking for. And that would be difficult again for Ukraine, because it's one thing to say, as a matter of fact, Russia is occupying this territory and it's going to be difficult for us to get it back. It's another thing to say, we concede this to Russia forevermore, which I don't think would be very popular in Ukraine, and essentially would be legitimizing the Russian aggression. So I think it's bound up, my guess is it's bound up with that Ukraine would have to say, we've lost it, we won't get this territory back.
Professor, let's speak a little bit about gray zone of security. What I mean, if, for example, we will have ceasefire, just imagine such scenario. And in that case, we have two scenarios as well. First scenario, if we have ceasefire and we have peacekeeping and support from West, it's one history, one scenario. Next scenario is if we just have ceasefire, no peacekeeping, no NATO perspective, no nuclear weapons, as our president just declared. I know, I see you laughing, yeah. And in the end, we will be at the same situation like before the war, in the gray zone of the security. And we will be at the beginning of this process.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned before, the problem with ceasefires is it's not it's a pause, or it could well just be a pause in the fighting rather than an end. Now, the ceasefire in Korea has lasted since 53. So, you can, that's what, 72 years. So they can go on a long time. But I mean, nobody would say that the situation between the two Koreas is relaxed or particularly stable. It's still dangerous. The difference for Ukraine now, I think, is in it now has a lot of military experience. It now has arsenal. It now has a defense industry. It's much better mentally and physically prepared for conflict than it was in 22. And I think the Russian concern, as indeed our concern about the Russians, would be that the time, as soon as the ceasefire is declared, you just start preparing for the next round of fighting, but you use the opportunity to replenish your forces, to help your forces recover, to rotate the front lines and all those things. And then at some point it'll start again. And that's obviously the concern and the risk. How likely that is impossible to say. And I think this comes back to our basic problem with all these discussions about the future is, we can have intelligent debates about what Ukrainians think and want. It's very hard to know what's going on in the Kremlin. Once I suspect in Russia there would be enormous relief with the end of the war, which would make it quite hard for Putin to start it all over again. I mean, I think this was, February 22 was this big gamble and it failed. In his terms, a lot of pain to Ukraine, but it failed to achieve what he wanted to achieve. Whether he could, actually gear the country up to do it again, I'm not sure. But Ukraine would have to worry that he could. So, and it would prepare for more. And I think Russia, if things went badly within Russia in the aftermath of the war, both countries have got major problems of readjustment from war to peace. If there were, and Russia suddenly looked weak, then I guess, Ukraine might see an opportunity in the future to take back what is rightfully theirs. And that's something that will be, Putin will want in any negotiations to try to prevent.
Professor, and the last one question, if it is possible, yeah. Many years, Russia was a part of European security. Now it is absolutely another situation. What countries and who right now are the part of the European security? USA, or maybe just European country, or maybe European country and Britain, maybe China involved as well. I don't know.
I mean, things are obviously quite fluid at the moment, and things that we thought were all settled and certain don't seem quite so settled and certain. I think basically the transatlantic community is still there. I don't think, Trump says things that make you worry about his commitment to it, but there's limits on what he can do and will do, I think, to disrupt that. So I think the basic NATO, including US, is still there, at least for the moment. And if it survives Trump, it'll probably survive anything. So that's still there. Russia, Russia's part of Europe, as is Ukraine, and as is Belarus, as is Georgia, Moldova, and so on. And I think we haven't got a good model for the European security system. And we tried to develop one after the end of the Cold War, and it sort of worked for some countries, but clearly not for others, not for Ukraine, not for Georgia, probably not in the end for Russia either. And of course, the problem for Russia now is that it's got itself wholly dependent upon China and has broken with Europe. But many Russians are very uncomfortable with that. They don't like that dependence on China. But how you manage this relationship in the future, especially so long as Putin is in power, is going to be very difficult because simply he's not trusted, and because he's shown aggressive intent. So I think the future of the European security system is bound up with the future of Russia, and we don't know. How long will Putin stay in power? Will there be a backlash against the policies of the last few years, particularly, say, the dependence upon China? How do you recover relations between Russia, the near abroad, the rest of Europe? I don't think we've got a good model about how to do this at the moment. And while Putin's in power, I'm not sure we can develop one. But a lot of Russians know this, but I think they're lost for ideas too. At the moment, they generally want their country to do well in the war and will support Putin. But I tend to suspect that if the war ended, even paused, they really would not want it to go back to it. I think they'd be looking for a much broader recovery from the war.
Professor, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.
Good to talk to you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.